also Tetiana Ugarkova, who is a Ukrainian literary scholar and journalist and teacher at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and heads the international department at Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. Please welcome.
And let me introduce Volodymyr Yermolenko, who is a Ukrainian philosopher and writer and essayist and journalist as well, head of ukraineworld.org at the Internews Ukraine. So please welcome him as well.
I'm also president of PEN Ukraine. You forgot about it. So we are very, very glad to be at Kyiv School of Economics and for this event. Co-organized by Kyiv School of Economics, PEN Ukraine, Ukraine World, and Ukraine Crisis Media Center. And the topic of today's talk is very interesting but very paradoxical. We called it Thinking About Borderline Experience. And frankly speaking, this was an interest by Marci. We talked a little bit about this at Yale 2 weeks ago. Maybe you had an opportunity to listen to this conversation. But of course, for us, it's a very vital topic because we are actually living in this borderline experience, Ukraine as a whole, and I'm sure that all people here know what we are talking about when we're talking about this. So, Marci, let me ask the first question: why this topic is interesting for you? Why this topic is interesting in the United States? Why this topic is interesting for you? As an intellectual historian, as a philosopher, as a person who is very active at American academic community, please.
Thank you. Well, first, thank you all for coming, and it's really a privilege for me to be here with Tanya and Volodya. It's just a couple weeks ago we were talking on the other side of the Atlantic, and now we're here continuing the conversation. And it's a privilege for me to be in Kiev in particular at this particular moment. So the idea of the border situation, which I should first of all say, it's not actually a phrase we have in English. I think both Volodya and I are translating from German into respective languages. You know, it's a concept that really comes, I think, from the German. The philosopher Karl Jaspers uses it, Grenzsituation, the idea of a situation that is on a border or on a boundary, and a kind of extremity. And for Jaspers, it was these kinds of situations when we are confronted with that which is outside the realm of the normal, outside of what can be understood and processed, outside of the everyday, that pushes us to the limits of human experience. That's when philosophy begins. You know, those are the moments that push us to philosophy. And he's not the only philosopher that's thought about this, and I'm happy to talk about a lot of others, or various others. I've been thinking about Jaspers recently. I'm not an expert on Jaspers, but for various reasons, you know, and one of which is that, you know, Karl Jaspers was a German who had a Jewish wife, and it was in Nazi Germany, you know, more or less the whole time, and was one of the people who never collaborated and remained a resistor, but yet stayed there, protected his wife, but obviously didn't, you know, save the whole world or bring down the Nazi regime. And then after the war wrote, in a series of lectures, a book called Die Schuldfrage, which in English was translated as The Question of German Guilt, you know, which became one of the first and one of the most essential texts for a German trying to grapple with how do you possibly look at what your country and your society has done? How is it possible to live afterwards? How is it possible to look the truth in the eye? What does it mean to have gone through this experience? And those are classic texts, and those are texts that I've known for a long time, but for very obvious reasons, it's something I've been thinking about a lot now. I mean, there were not many voices in Germany during the war like Karl Jaspers and like Thomas Mann. There were not very many voices who spoke out among the intellectuals against Nazism. But the few there were really mattered. They mattered then, and I think they matter now. There's a reason why we go back to those texts, and try to understand. And I think it's not merely a kind of coincidence that Jasper's philosophy was so focused on this idea of what are these border experiences that could drive us to philosophy, and that he was one of the only ones who somehow maintained a kind of moral lucidity through this whole experience. And then the other philosopher I've been thinking obsessively about, as Konstantin knows, who is one of my very favorites, is Lev Shestov, who's a Jewish philosopher from Tsarist Kiev. And during the First World War, he spent a lot of time abroad. He was living in Switzerland before the First World War. He comes back to the Russian Empire during the First World War, and he's between Moscow and Kiev and villages, and he experiences the whole war and then experiences the Bolshevik Revolution, in this space. And during that time, he writes a polemic with Husserl's phenomenology, and I promise I'm not going to subject all of you to a long explanation of Husserl's phenomenology, which is something I work on and I'm very attached to, but I will spare you. My children would say, "Mommy, please don't bore the audience with Husserlian phenomenology."
We just published a podcast, a Kult podcast about Husserl with Vachtan Kibuladze, so don't worry, people who are here should know about him as well.
Okay, so maybe this is what you need to know. In any case, Husserl, who was a German of Jewish origin, in fact, he was originally from the Habsburg Empire, from Moravia, but his obsession was reaching absolute truth. That there had to be a way to find a bridge, from the subject to the object, from mind to world, from consciousness to being. That big philosophical question, like, how do we know this bottle of water exists and it's not just, inside our own consciousness? How do we know it's really there? How do we know the world is really there? How do you go from inside to outside? Leszek Kolakowski called this the problem of the bridge from subject to object. And Husserl was obsessed with finding it and felt that if he did not find that bridge, life was not worth living. Either, yes, we get to epistemological clarity and absolute certainty, or we might as well slit our wrist. It's the madhouse. There's no point in going on. And Shestov grasped that kind of existential dynamic in Husserl, I think, better than anybody else. And in the midst of the First World War, in the Tsarist Empire, reading Husserl in German, he had never met Husserl at that time, he writes this polemical response called Memento Mori. Remember, you are mortal. And he said, and he's clearly very empathetic to the attempt, to that despair of what if we can't reach absolute truth? There has to be a way, And he says, Husserl wants to believe in that infinite power of reason. But the problem with reason, he says, is that reason is all well and good for the middle zones of human experience. It's all well and good most of the time. Ordinarily, our reason can do what we need to do. But there are these border zones. There are these border zones of human experience where reason cannot reach. And that's where philosophy begins. Maybe I'll wait.
The only way how we can really know that the bottle exists is when we are thirsty. When we are thirsty, there is a big difference whether the bottle exists or it doesn't. But I want to address Tanya, and really I want us to travel a bit from the very empiric experience to the big ideas and compare them. And we will definitely come back to both Jaspers and Shestov and other thinkers that are necessary in this pantheon. But let us think, Tanya, about what we are going through now. We were invited by Book Arsenal to present a focus topic this year, and somehow it coincided without us being in dialogue with Marci about the focus topic. sounds like життя на межі, living on the edge, or life on the edge. And it is really inspired by our constant travel to the frontline zones. What do you get from this experience of being in Kherson, being in Izium, being in Kramatorsk-Slovyansk, being in Nikopol, being in Marhanets, talking to people there, cooperating with them, doing some things with them? What do you get from this?
Thank you, Volodya, but let me add a bit about Husserl first, because it's not a
This is what the people in Kherson also tell us all the time.
Yes, exactly, because, so you mentioned Lev Shestov. I remember we were fond of Lev Shestov when we were students with Volodymyr. We were reading his texts when we were 20 years old. And now I'm teaching a course at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy for my literary students, and we address phenomenology, and we talk about Roman Ingarten, who is a kind of disciple of Husserl, but also somebody who didn't agree on everything in this, I would say, second period of Husserl. And Roman Ingarten, as you know, is also linked to Ukraine because he lived for a while in Lviv and then later on in Kharkiv, and he belongs clearly to the German tradition. But I remember a thing I tell my students during this course, that after the Second World War, in relation to what you said about Jasper's situation, he refused to write his books in German. And he wrote a number of books in Polish. And he was also eager to know everything, just to know this intentional mode of being. He wrote a whole book when he described, if I'm not mistaken, 98 ontological ways of being. So he was really fanatic of this thing. But he was also sensible to this, existential, I would say, and political implication of what was going on. So the choice of language was important for him after the Second World War. Not for him not being German, but belonging to this German tradition. So coming back to what Volodymyr asked me to develop. So yes, indeed. So what we are going through now, I mean, not us, but I mean all of us, I mean all Ukrainians at that moment. So we are going through a very existential situation when we do understand what does it mean to be on the edge of a kind of normality, what you name normality, to be in this liminal, as you say, Marci, liminal experience. So it's an experience when you are so close to death that never before, because all of us Ukrainians, we do know that we can be destroyed physically at literally every moment. Maybe this feeling is not so sharp when you're in Kyiv, but I'm pretty sure that everybody in our audience knows this feeling when there were severe shellings here in Kyiv as well, specifically in the beginning of this full-scale invasion in February 22, March 2022, and then later in 2023 as well. And what is important is when we travel a lot with Volodymyr, with our friends from Pan-Ukraine. A lot of them are present in this audience today, Tetiana Teren, Maxim Sitnikov and others. We try to go to the edge of where the life ends and where a kind of desert starts. And we ask ourselves, why are we so attracted in a way to go to these places which are so destroyed, where there is no more life? I mean, literally no more life, no more houses, no more villages, no more cities, just a kind of a total ruins, a result of this total war. And whom do we meet there? And one of the explanations why do we get there is that to meet people who are present there. And every time we get back, we are so much inspired by people we met there, both civilians, I mean ordinary people. When we say civilians, this is not a normal structure of the society. These are not, like, for example, here in Kyiv or New York, when you go outside, you see a normal society. It means you see women and men and old and young, and you see kids and kind of life. But when you go to the front line, you see how old the people are getting. So young people, they don't stay there. And children, for sure, they're not staying there. For example, today in the news, what you can read is that children are evacuated from Sumy region. Why? Because there's immediate danger at Sumy region now, so kids are evacuated in the first place. And so you meet all these people who stay, who made this choice to stay, as Jaspers stayed in a different context, but he stayed in this dangerous and challenging situation during the Second World War. People who stay, and we ask ourselves, and them, why, what attaches you to this situation, and we see that people, they cannot do otherwise, because there are a lot of links which link them to their situation. Be it, I don't know, the fact that their family was killed there. It happened to us to meet people who lost everybody of their family. We met a man, and we'll be writing about him in our book with Volodymyr, a man in Izium who lost 8 members of his family in 1 second. We met a lady who also lost 8 members. I'm mistaken, 7, I'm sorry. Myhyla lost 7 members of his family, and this lady lost 8 members of her family, including grandchildren. And still these people are staying in this place just to preserve memory and to be there, even if their homes are destroyed. And yeah, this is about knowledge, about what human being is. This is not only an economical reason. This is not only a practical reason, because most of these people, they have kind of relatives somewhere for example, for Myhyla, it's Cherkasy region. Some others, they could have moved, from Kherson as well. When we meet young people in Kherson, by the way, just 1 week ago, we met extraordinary young people in Kherson, and one of them, there were 3 of them, and one of them a girl, she's from Kyiv, and she moved to Kherson because her boyfriend, her new love, is here. So she moved there for existential reasons. So our question is, so what does it tell us about human being? To be in danger, to be in places which are not normal in any way, because there are shellings, because there are explosions, because there are any physical risk to be eliminated just in 1 second. Why do people do so? It's not only the question of necessity, because most of these people, they make this choice. So it's kind of existential questions for us, and that's why we travel a lot. And then military, for sure. We meet a lot with Volodymyr, and with our friends, we meet a lot of military, Ukrainian military, because we are transporting cars to the front line. And for sure, military, they have a different universe. They are obliged to be there, they're just receiving orders. But what does it mean for them to be there? We noticed with Volodymyr that the strongest people we met among military, they're people who have something beyond this border. The 20% of Ukrainian territory is occupied now by Russians. So, and a lot of people lost their homes. They could be somewhere in, I don't know, in Pologi, in Zaporizhia region, or somewhere in, I don't know, in Starobilsk, in Lugansk region, or in Lugansk, in Donetsk, in Crimea, whatever. So, and there are people living here on the edge and just looking on the other side of this border and doing everything possible to get it back. To get back what is destroyed, because it's your home, because it's your school, because it's your kindergarten, where your kids, for example, were. So all these strong people who they are there to do what other people, they believe to be their opinions or to be their beliefs, And this kind of existential threat and people, both civilians and military, who are so strong and so determined to be on the edge. So it's something which fascinates us with Volodymyr, and we'll be writing about that in our book.
Thank you, Tanya, and let me come back to Marci, and coming back to these big names like Jaspers. So what kind of makes me think about Karl Jaspers and some other people, that he is so much overshadowed by some other figures of the German philosophy and of the European philosophy. And in particular, I'm thinking about Heidegger. Heidegger, who have done much worse moral choices, who has much more complicated philosophy, But the thing is, why Heidegger became still very popular after the Second World War, despite all these troubles, I mean, outside Germany, in France in particular, and then in the United States, is that he had the conception of history, which is completely, far away from reality. Like for him, for Heidegger, history is the thing that happens between Heraclitus and himself, like very, very long, some changes. He absolutely overlooked the Second World War. He doesn't speak about this. He doesn't care about this. And I think this is the reason why Hannah Arendt, of whose relations with Heidegger we know, complicated relations, amorous relations, and then friendly relations, and then criticism and all, why she became a political philosopher, why she became a political historian. Because she was saying, look, Martin, dear Martin, your conception of history is wrong. Because your conception of history doesn't have people there. It doesn't have these cracks in history, these liminal moments where history just comes over you like a bulldozer, and then you're obliged to react on this as a citizen and to think, etc. And I think this popularity of Heidegger compared to people like Jaspers is also kind of a diagnosis to the way how European maybe philosophy started to developing after the Second World War. But my question is this: what we are kind of feeling with Natalia and maybe with many other Ukrainians, that if you talk about this metaphor of the edge, it's not like edge counter against the center. It's not like postmodern things or post-structuralism things like there's this tension between edge and the center. Is that the edge becomes the center. The Grenzsituation becomes the center because it is there where everything plays. It is there where the truth is. It is there where, unless you feel it, you don't really know life. And then, when we think about like history of philosophy, we think that many revolutionary things happened during these cracks of history, during the fact when history was like in volcano. So we tend to think about Hegel like this very boring professor at the cafedra, but Hegel was born during Napoleonic Wars, and unless he was living in the world where everything was crushing down, he was not probably Hegel. Or when we're thinking about, I don't know, people like Thomas Hobbes, like revolutionary thinker of the political philosophy, unless he went through the civil war in England, he was probably not able to formulate this idea of Leviathan and all the rest. So what do you think? Do you think that our times, that I'm calling dark times following Hannah Arendt, do you think that they create something?
Yeah, lots of questions. So I've only been in Kyiv a couple days, and this is the second time that someone has been asking me about Arendt and Heidegger. I did a podcast with Volodymyr Yermolenko yesterday. She wanted to talk about Arendt and Heidegger, which is quite remarkable. And perhaps
if you ask security guys here, they will talk with you about Arendt and Heidegger. So.
Arendt is, I should first say, one of my first and most long-lasting loves. So the triangle of, not the love triangle, but the triangle of Jaspers, Arendt, and Heidegger is also very interesting. One of Heidegger's idea of the border that was so important here is this idea that, first of all, and most of the time, we live our lives in this inauthentic way, kind of just going along with the everyday, doing what everyone else is doing, not really taking hold of our own existence. That's most of the time we are conformist. We're going along with the crowd. What shakes us into authenticity, is this looking at our human condition, which for Heidegger is Sein zum Tode, it is being towards death with eyes wide open. The fact that we are always already moving towards our own death. That ultimate border experience of death. It's always in some way about death. What does it mean to face our own mortality? And Heidegger says most of the time we flee from that knowledge. We choose not to think about the fact that we're proceeding towards our own until sometimes we're shaken into it, and then we are overcome by what he calls angst, which is a kind of anxiety that is different from fear, because it doesn't take an object, like I'm afraid of snakes. But angst is, what you are afraid of is nothing. It is precisely this nothingness on the other side of the border. And this Unheimlichkeit, I think Yerko translated Unheimlichkeit into like Niesamolitos, or something like that in Ukrainian, which I was very curious about. Because in English we translate it as uncanniness, which is not, it's not quite right. It's literally the sense of not being at home in the world.
Yeah, Heimlichkeit, Heimat is being at
From
home.
Heim, yeah, from Heim. And how can we be at home in this world when we're always moving towards our own death? And that idea of that border, that confrontation, that terror, is for Heidegger a somehow ontologically and epistemologically privileged position. And if you read it, though, you think, okay, he gives you no incentive to do that, to be authentic, because it's extremely unpleasant. It's kind of terrifying. But if you really want that, if you really, to be shaken into authenticity, is to have that encounter. And Arendt, then, one of the ways in which she comes back at him, which is something that in connection to Ukraine I've been thinking about obsessively, is she counters being towards death with natality, with birth. Not that she denies being towards death. I mean, we all know we're going to die. But for her, in some sense, what is the essential thing about the human condition is our capacity to set something new in motion, to give birth to something new. And this is what she then talks about in The Human Condition, which is a book she says in a letter to Heidegger she is silently dedicated to him. If things had gone differently, she would have written that dedication, and there are many things that did not go differently. But this, can the setting something new in motion, that is also a border, of a different kind. And can that also be an epistemologically privileged position? And that's then connected to revolution.
That's all very, very important. So it sounds very abstract, but I think it's really, really important, because if a culture is focused on death, and this is, I think, we have right now in the Russian political culture, this kind of a necrophilic drive that only expands death, that basically produces very, very, very dark consequences. So first, it is formulated in the intellect, in the discourse, and then it goes outside to reality. And it's interesting, like for me, the Ukrainian culture of the past decades was really about birth, about really creativity and invention. But I will address Tanya with we will talk about Ukrainian tradition as well, intellectual tradition, because I mean it's perfectly clear that in our tradition this experience, borderline experience, is more experience of the past centuries, and it's really necessary to think about it. But I will ask Tanya about the French tradition, because Tanya knows it very, very well. And in the French tradition of the 20th century, you have this also play with this idea of margins, limits. You have this in this, let's say, tradition of Descartes and bataille, this transition, the idea that the task of culture, the task of philosophy and literature is go beyond certain borders. And then you have, of course, post-structuralist tradition that says that thinking about the borders is always a practice, anti-totalitarian practice. So we work against the power relations when we try to take something which was marginalized and highlight. What do you think we can take from this with us into the 21st century, and what we need to leave behind? Because my personal vision is that we certainly need to leave behind this transgression tradition. What do you think?
Too many questions in one.
This is like at home,
It's impossible.
You ask me even more questions.
Impossible to summarize all the French tradition in one response, but I would probably start where Marci was talking about Jasper's and about this experience of death. Immediately, I thought about Albert Camus, who is, as you know, also in this line of writers, but also philosophers, was trying to think it over. And what you were talking about creativity and about this universe and other limits, so that in a way is our limit. I remember, as I also tell my students, because I teach a course on French literature, that it's quite simplest way to see Camus as only somebody who was writing about absurd, about this absurdist world, about, and you remember his formula of why there is no reason in this world, because we are all mortal, so because in the end you always find these deaths, these bloody, as he said, bloody mathematics of death. So anybody, so we are mortal, so and this angst, you were talking in Jasper's context, it resonates in Camus context as well. But what is interesting about Camus is that he was not talking only about that, he was talking about kind of dialectics of this starting, his departure point was the idea of death, which is waiting for us at any moment. But he was developing it later in a different idea. So the second stage of the dialectics was a kind of revolt. It means rebellion, right? Rebellion, so Rebel Man and all his texts about how to fight against absurd. And he was talking a lot about passion in this text, about passion. So passion which encounters this death, this disappearance, this nonsense of human existence, because it's limited. And another passion, extraordinary thing about Camus, he was dead in this car accident, and he was still very young. But what we know from his diaries is that he had another stage of the development of this dialectics, which he has not developed simply because he was dead. And this last stage of dialectics, starting from absurd and to rebellion, was about love. He planned to write a drama, a philosophical essay, and a novel about love. What you were talking about, this new beginning, about this creativity as another poet, about human experience, it could relate to it. So in French tradition, you have also these links to these ideas, trying to link this idea of death and new beginnings as well. Coming back to Volodymyr's question, which is extremely huge, maybe only some elements. So your question was basically about what do we think today about this idea of center and border and transgression. Let me maybe now emphasize only one thing, and in a very practical way. So you mentioned this postmodern idea about center and the border and this label in the center, and I think that what we feel now practically in Ukraine is that we feel that we are borderline in a way, in many ways, because we are in the border of Europe, because we don't really, we try to belong, but we don't not officially belong, for example, to such structures like European Union. We strive for decades, or for many years, not for decades, but for many years to join NATO, and we feel that what we have behind us, it's all the civilization, all the philosophy, all the literature we love. And what you have in front of us is this empire, this aggressive empire, this death. Volodymyr wrote excellent post on Facebook today about this empire of death and Google. So I will not quote that, but we have this destruction, this senseless destruction, and it's quite literal. This is not a metaphor. This is when you see it with your own eyes, you see how crazy human nature could be by capturing territories at the price of completely destroying everything on its way. And so we are facing it. And what we feel that we are on the edge, on the way, on this frontier, but at the same time, we are the center of this civilization, because we know the real price in terms of human lives and personal devotion. What does it mean? What the real price of freedom is? What the real price of normality is? What the real price of humanity is? It's just, oh, I don't know, these ideas about environment. So when you see, for example, and you've seen a number of people who were risking their lives to save, for example, animals. You've seen that in Kyiv, in Irpin, you've seen that in Kherson. So there's humanity aspects. And so in the center, where everything is born, it's not the end, it's not the edge of the story. This is where history begins, where people are able and willing, this part of people are willing and able to be what they think, and not only to speculate on this, but to be themselves, just embodying a way what they think. And in this way, the edge could be the center. And being on the edge of the history, you are in the center of the history, because you know what does it mean to be free to move. When there is when you're in Kherson, for example, you cannot move freely, because if you move, you try to be close to walls, to buildings, because it's dangerous, and danger could come anyway from any moment. So it's a kind of emptiness around you, and you are just not free to move physically. I'm not talking about people who live on occupied territories. They're not free to join their families, and we know very tragic stories of people, families who were separated by this war, but kids as well, who were stolen by Russia, all these kinds of things. So what does it mean to be free to move, to take your ticket and to go, I don't know, to New York, for example. And so this age could be also the center. And all these ideas of our intellectual history about center, they would be not so true as they seem to be about the history.
No, I'm really glad you said that. Both you and Volodymyr brought up this fact that the Grenza, this limit, is not actually margin, it's the center. And it's a very different understanding of edge or border from the colonialism conversation about center and periphery. It's not about periphery, it's literally about this kind of existential borderline. And this is precisely this feeling that I have, and that's why I am selfishly here, kind of feeding off your experience in some way. I mean, I think I can speak in some ways for many of my friends and colleagues. My friend Amelia is here. It's not random that that I'm drawn here, because and part of it is this intellectual interest and a historical interest in this notion of the border experience, and this understanding that precisely here is the center now, and the sense that this is the border, this is the vanguard, this is the edge of where the thinking is, and I selfishly feel like I don't want to miss it. Like I don't want to be removed. I don't want to be somewhere else. And I thought this way very much, as some of you know, I wrote this book about the Maidan, which was not my revolution, it was your revolution. And there's a reason why I was completely captivated by it. Even though it was not my own and I had no right to claim it in any way. But in all my adult life, which I've been hanging out in Eastern Europe, because I was trained as a Slavicist, it was the first real revolution that was kind of playing out in my time. And I saw these ideas that I was interested in the abstract, playing themselves out, in real life. And it was impossible. I saw people kind of existentially transforming in front of me. It was impossible to turn away from that, because you have a sense of it being this existentially, epistemologically privileged moment. You talked about Camus, one of the other famous relationships or dramatic relationships somewhat gone wrong is Camus and Sartre. And one of the things that captivated me about the Maidan was Sartre's idea of temporality, you know, and how does time work? Philosophers have long been obsessed with this problem of time because well, what is the present? There's no way to grab hold of the present because it has no duration. As soon as you try to catch it, it's already passed. And so, you know, lots of people much smarter than myself have spent a lot of time thinking about this. You know, and Sartre had this idea that the present was kind of like a border between the en soi and the pour soi, the kind of between facticity and transcendence, between what had already happened and who you have been up to that moment and cannot be changed, what's inert, and then that possibility of going beyond, that possibility of something more. And that border, in principle, is with us every moment of every day, but we usually don't notice it. It's not illuminated. You know, and what I felt people were experiencing or trying to convey during the Maidan was that this was a revolutionary moment where suddenly you cast a glaring light on that border. Suddenly everyone is shaken into an awareness of being on that border. And then the role of choice is eliminated. Maybe we should talk about choice. Let's talk about choice.
Can I raise a little bit different topic, because we will certainly talk about this. But what is happening here, and it's very important, and I really want us to all think about together. It's what we are trying to do. And when we were going here with Marci, I was telling you what actually we try to do. Is to bring our experience, very painful, very courageous, very dramatic, very tragic, and put it in parallel with big ideas of the intellectual tradition, and see what works and what doesn't work. Because our borderline experience is this volcanic experience that makes us rethink many other concepts. And Tanya mentioned it's a very good thing that you mentioned this, death as a metaphor. Remember that? You mentioned it just now, death as a metaphor. So I think that you said death is not a metaphor. And I think if Susan Sontag was alive, and we are a privileged situation to talk very closely to her son, David Reeve. So if she was alive, she would probably write a book, Death as the Metaphor, as a kind of a parallel to illness as a metaphor, where she would probably say that death is not a metaphor, which is a very banal thing, but for 20th century is not a banal thing at all. Because all the 20th century was to put the death as a metaphor. Like Heidegger was talking about death of metaphysics, Derrida was talking death of something, Roland Barthes was talking about death of the author, etc. As if these people were playing with the word death without really taking it seriously. And I think this is the way how we take this seriously. And another thing with border, because my problem with this idea of borderland margin versus center is that it is too geometrical. That our lives are not geometrical at all. And we here come up with another thing, which is much more biological, organic. We're talking about birth, and this is, I think, very important. So what is happening here is not really a center against the margins, but it's birth against death, it's life against death. These are the metaphors. And look, there are two powerful metaphors about Ukraine. One belongs to Tim Snyder, which is Bloodlands. Another belongs to Philippe Lochier, which is Gates of Europe. Both are brilliant, and I think both are insufficient. Right? Because Bloodlands, of course, Timothy is talking about this period, the 30s and the 40s. Obviously, there's nothing else to talk about, probably. But it's very important that to talk about this realm of death. Whereas, obviously, like Philippe is talking about the beginning of Europe, but the problem is, and this is also our physical experience, that gates of Europe is not actually the gates, it's just a collection of ruins. Collection of ruins, a collection of mutilated bodies, collection of dead people, this assembly of dead people. And that's the problem. So it's like so existential work between life and death, life and birth. Of course, there is a big metaphor for us to talk about Ukraine as a birth in Europe, but frankly speaking, we are on this borderline where the new society can be born or it can be dead. We are not guaranteed that everything will pass smoothly, that we will win this war. Nothing is clear. So I think we need to think about this as well. But I will ask two final questions.
May I just add to your brilliant ideas about this? This is a matter.
Sure.
No. Yeah, I don't think this is not.
Oh, brilliant ideas that I have is actually.
But yeah. The way you develop it makes me think about multiple examples in the 20th century of this. There's like a metaphor. Look at I don't know, starting from André Gide, and this idea of acte gratuit. Acte gratuit. How would you translate? Free act, yeah? When somebody you kill just like not even to kill somebody, but to prove your subjectivity.
It's like Raskolnikov?
Like exactly. And then you have in Camus, for example, this in Stranger, Étranger, you have exactly the same idea of this. Patrice Merceau, he's killing this Arab man on the beach for nothing. It's like a metaphor of this nothingness of his being. And then, for example, you take the surrealists who were close to communists, André Breton and etc., and all these companies, they were talking about surrealistic act, which consists to go down streets and to kill, I don't know, 6 people in a row, which is...
We just don't know what does it mean in reality.
Yeah, exactly. And it comes back to what you were saying. So it's not this, and when you see it on a daily basis, and unfortunately, we are, all of us, we are very much exposed to all kinds of pictures, photos coming not only from media, but also from social media, and unfortunately, from people we know, from relatives, from friends. Everybody here has this painful experience when you look at the photos and you see what exactly is violent. We are talking about violence. We are also talking about death from absence of medicaments somewhere close to the borderline, death of any kind of reason. So, and you're confronted to this physicality of what was really going on, and it's not a metaphor in a way. So, and this is a book, right? This is a concept to explore.
And let me just ask two last questions to both of our speakers and invite the audience to ask more questions. And these two questions will be about our reality and our tradition. And the first will be about Shestov. And I will ask Tanya afterwards about the Ukrainian tradition, like certain things to realize and to think. So Shestov, frankly speaking, when Marci told me that she would like to make an event about Shestov, I was kind of skeptical. My attitude to Shestov is double. First, I do think that we need to work with him as an example of Kyiv philosophy. I do think that we need to take him from like the Russian philosophical tradition, because basically the way how he thinks is not really in the tradition of the Russian philosophy. I know Russian philosophy quite well, unfortunately. He's definitely inscribed into this Kyiv Jewish culture, and it's very interesting to develop and to understand it. He definitely tries to oppose this Jewish culture to the what he calls Athens, what he calls the Greek and Roman tradition and Western European tradition. So, but what is problematic for me is precisely what you said, is that he's trying to oppose to this rational tradition by suggesting a kind of a very, very like apotheosis of irrationality, or his text, apotheosis of non-groundness. I don't know how to translate it. And here's our problem, is that my problem with him is that here in this reality where it's all irrational, it's all absurdist, we don't need Albert Camus to write absurdist plays here, we don't need We don't need Beckett and Ionesco, because the reality has been so absurd for many, many centuries. And we need an idea that you can be rational, that there is reason in humans. And therefore, Ukrainian tradition is a constant fight between certain emotionality, but also certain rationality. It's an illusion to think that all Ukrainian tradition is just emotions and literature. We have Skovoroda, who is quite rational. We have Drahomanov, who is quite rational. We have lots of very good scientists in humanities and social sciences. So my question is for you, does Shestov really give us a kind of emancipation from the totalitarian reason, or he brings us back to this horrible irrationality in which basically Russian philosophy is so good at, because they're saying, okay, you can't understand Russia without reason, with reason. Provocative question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I love that question. And I hadn't exactly thought about that critique of Shestov, but now I'm going to think about it more. Well, maybe I should first explain. So I come to Shestov from a very different angle, as somebody who's not Ukrainian and not Russian. And I should maybe also explain that, so Volodya and Tanya are real philosophers. I'm an intellectual historian, and that
I'm not a philosopher.
We are surreal philosophers.
And it's one of the things that, that makes it a little bit different, what I do with a lot of these same texts that we've all studied and we've all worked with, is that a lot of the writing I do is putting these characters in the context of their lives. So I'm finishing now this long book that I've been working on for many years, and if these world historical catastrophes would stop, it would be finished, but I keep being distracted by, things like, tyranny threatening to destroy the world, and then that takes up my attention. But the book is about encounters, a history of encounters among thinkers who are connected to phenomenology. So there's a very historical biographical element to it. So I encounter Shestov as an interlocutor of Husserl, who is in dialogue with Masaryk at the time, and Gustav Spiet, and Ilyin to a certain extent, and then kind of moves forward. So a lot of the reading I do about, I've read Husserl's correspondence with Shestov, I've read Shestov's correspondence with Spiet. I look at Shestov also from this very kind of how was he in real life kind of way. I tell my students that Natalia suffered through my lecture course. She may be the only person here who actually suffered through my lecture course, but I tell them at the very beginning of the intellectual history course of okay, this is not philosophy, it's intellectual history. That means that nobody can get canceled, because history was not just the history of people who were nice or were good or were innocent. You couldn't teach history at all if you edited out all that stuff. And we never bracket real life. You can't put real life in brackets and say it doesn't matter who people were, what they did, it only matters the ideas, because this is history, everything matters. And so one of the reasons I really fell in love with Shestov, in some ways simultaneous with reading him and appreciating his ideas, of all these characters in the book, and it goes through a couple, including Ingarden, and Shestov was a much better person than Ingarden in all sorts of ways, although I like Ingarden as well. We could talk about of these characters who go through a couple generations. He was the most deeply decent in all sorts of ways. This kind of Menschlichkeit that they would say. At all of these moments where many people behaved either selfishly or coldly, or completely retreated and said, I'm going to do my own thing and not care what's happening to other people. Shestov was always very deeply human. He was always looking out for his friends, including his friends who were his philosophical opponents. When Gustav Spiet had left his wife and daughter somewhere in Switzerland and was running around with his new lover who was pregnant with his child and was involved in this long kind of argument with, accusing, Shestov of being a skeptic and of being intellectually dishonest, Shestov and his wife, meanwhile, were with great concern checking on the wife and the daughters in Switzerland and making sure they were okay and writing back to Spiad and reassuring him that his kids were okay, and if they needed anything, he would help them. And so part of my love for Shestov has to deal with the fact that a lot of these great thinkers were not very nice, or they at least behaved in selfish ways and all.
If you want to be a great thinker, don't be nice.
But he was actually deeply decent all the way through. And he was Husserl's greatest opponent and also becomes one of his closest friends. There was always this deep respect for the human. But it's true that he's constantly up against the limits of reason, but I think doesn't revel in it in the same way as some of the other Russian thinkers. But I'm now going to think about this more that you brought it up. But the other thing I like about Shestov is that he's a deeply dialogical thinker. He's always, all of his works are somehow, he's talking to Dostoevsky, he's talking to Nietzsche, he's talking to Kierkegaard, he's talking to Husserl. He's not as self-absorbed as a lot of these other people. He's always letting other thinkers provoke him. He's reading into them. He's trying to appreciate them. Even when he disagrees, he's taking what's essential. So there's a kind of generosity and a kind of openness to him. And that's, maybe also maybe this is also a very selfish way of looking at it, because I come to Eastern Europe as an American who came here in the early 1990s when there was a lot of discussion about who had a right to speak or didn't have a right to speak, and who was superior and who was inferior, and what were that combination of superiority and inferiority complexes that people had coming from different sides of the Iron Curtain. And there was a lot of kind of kto about the whole thing, like who was on top and who was the bottom. And Shestov was one of those thinkers in that tradition of dialogue, that intellectual life could be dialogical. You could be engaged with people in a way that you were provoking one another to think, and it didn't have to be this vertical hierarchy. And that way of thinking I continue to really appreciate from him.
I do think that there is something Kievan in this way of thinking, and maybe this is an illusion, but the way I think what we can take from Shestov is real ability to talk with big names like Augustinus, Pascal, and Montaigne and Plato, is kind of in a very horizontal way, and taking this idea seriously and taking it taking them really existentially. But what I admire about you, Marci, and is that, doing intellectual history is also a big part of philosophy, and what you're doing with team is bringing together history and philosophy, history and thinking. And that leads us to our first hero, Karl Jaspers, and to my point that Heidegger had a very wrong conception of history, contrary to Karl Jaspers, because Jaspers was saying, look, to be a philosopher, just read history books. Because if you read history books, my problem with history books is that I have such a horrible memory that I can't really remember what happened. But when you read history books and you go to this Grenzsituation and you go to these situations of big changes, you understand how people behave, how people go up and down, and this is basically, this is a lesson that history never ends, right? And when history never ends, this space opens up for new thinking, new ideas. My last question to Tanya, let's think a little bit about our tradition, our Ukrainian intellectual tradition. Because let's just be serious. I mean, when we look at the major characters of the Ukrainian culture, let's take just literature, it's such a horrible thing how people were annihilated when we were so young. Like, Kyiv-Mohyla wrote his Misto when he was, I think, 27. And he was arrested when he was 33. He died, and he was killed when he was, I think, 36, 37. Like, Yuri Yanovsky wrote his Meister Korabля, I think he was 28. And, he was not executed, but he faced the reality where it was impossible basically to write. Taras Shevchenko was arrested when he was, I think, 33 in 1847, if I'm not mistaken. And you can continue the story. There is the exposition in the Ukrainian house about Alla Horska, who was killed. Mykola Levantovich was killed, Murashko was killed, and so many other examples. And this is really living on the edge, meaning that living in a situation when your culture can be amputated, can be just killed at any moment. How should we think about this, except for this narrative? Okay, our culture was exterminated. This is, of course, obvious and very tragic thing, but I do think that we need to go a little bit farther. And my takeaway from this is this metaphor of amputated future, and the idea that future is one of the big elements of the culture in general, and of human happiness. If you don't have future, you don't have happiness. And we were living in a situation where we didn't have future for many, many decades. And probably this opens up to today's reality, when despite all these tragedies and pains, Ukrainians still believe in future. What do you think?
Once again, too many questions in one, but brilliant questions. And I'll start addressing to what Marci told us and try to link all this.
So Tanya always does not respond my questions.
What you said about the reasons why you admire Shestov, I think this is fantastic, in fact. So you admire Shestov because you never pronounced the word ethics, but it's about that, right? So it's about just bother about who left his wife or not left. So it's important for you because, and this is, I think this is normal it's something very human to address big philosophers from this human perspective. Like, because when we talk about culture, what culture is about? Culture is a fight for eternity. Who is stronger? He stays where? In eternity. So he fights against immediate, I don't know, people around him or her, about immediate situations. And he or she fights to stay somewhere, where, I don't know exactly where, but in a kind of eternity, in a canon or whatever. So just to be the strongest. And regardless of what people will think about you, regardless this wife or this kid or whatever. And what you speak, Marci, about, and it links to Ukrainian situation, you speak about this integrity of a personality in both thinking and living and acting, and this integrity is priceless. And I think that when we look at our Ukrainian history, which is exactly what, as Volodymyr said, has this amputated future, and unfortunately it doesn't stop at the examples you mentioned in this Renaissance in the 20s or in dissidence movement. Unfortunately, today we have this amputated future with our friends, with, for example, in literature, Victoria Melina, who was our friend, our poet, and who is not normal here because Russian missile killed her. And we can talk about Maxim Krivtsov, who was a Ukrainian poet and who was killed 33. So it's repeating of the same situation. But when I speak about Ukrainian tradition, I'm not a great specialist in Ukrainian intellectual history, but I'm pretty sure that the most important thing when we read these texts, regardless 20s, 30s, 50s or 60s, what is important is that we always pay attention to how people behaved in this extremely difficult situation. I would say simply totalitarian situation. So how did they address the issues of their friends, how they were denouncing or not denouncing, how they were protecting their families, what price they paid or didn't pay to stay alive, etc., etc. And I think that in Ukrainian intellectual history, we'll find a lot of good examples of people who really had a lot of integrity. What Marci loves about philosophers, you'll find a lot of this stuff in Ukrainian history. Unfortunately, because this was a very tragic history in the 20th century, and there were a lot of oppression, a lot of murders, a lot of prosecutions, and still is, yes, because of this aggression. So the lesson we can take from the previous century to our century is that should never sacrifice your right to be in this internal world, I mean, this canon, by being not integral person in your immediate context with people who are around you, with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family. So maybe this is a good lesson we can take of this century.
And maybe last thought, I always say that maybe inaccurately, I'm sorry for people who study Ukrainian literature, but I as a philosopher always simplify. So I always say that the greatest Ukrainian writer is Lesya Ukrainka. And I always say that, well, the peak of her creativity is dramas. So she's the best, well, the best of her creation for me personally is drama, is her plays. And drama is precisely about Grenzsituation. Drama, Shakespearean drama, Aeschylean drama, Sophoclean drama, Rossinian drama, Lesya Ukrainchina drama is about borderline situation, about the situation when you need to make very fast choices. We didn't talk about choices. Very fast choices. When time is faster than you, when time is faster than you, when history is so much fast that it happens just in one day. In one day, the whole world collapses, and you need to make choices. And maybe it's not accidental that. And I think it's not reflected too much still. We start reflecting about this, that basically Ukraine is very strong in drama, in particular in the image of Lesya Ukrainka, because there is this strength of Shakespearean drama in her, I think.
You've noticed, Marci, that talking about philosophy, Volodymyr asks a lot about philosophy, but he responds, and I also provide examples with literature examples. So, like, there's not so much distinction between philosophy and literature.
Questions? Oh, great. Who will moderate? Who will pass the microphone?
So, Tatiana, Marci, Volodymyr, thank you very much for a very insightful, thought-provoking discussion. So, I wanted to ask about this Grenzsituation and leadership, like how it affects leadership, because we see that the war situation or revolution situation, it changes a lot, especially political leadership. And in Ukraine, we see a lot of discussions about the Western leaders who double think about whether giving weapons or not, the amount of weapons, and Ukrainian part of leadership. When we see how this war, it changes the way people think, it changes the way how decisions are made, it changes the very characters of leadership. So what can you say about it? What, in your opinion, is leadership during such periods of time? Thank you.
Okay, as ladies think, I will just make, when I was in New York just 2 weeks ago, I met a wonderful man whose name is David Bell. I don't know if you know him. Marci, who is a professor at Princeton, professor of French history. And he is the son of Daniel Bell, who is a famous American sociologist. And I bought his books, and his books are about French history, about Napoleon. He has a biography of Napoleon. I asked him what he thinks about this new Napoleon movie. I will not retell you his response. But it's interesting that he was saying that democracy is not only about institutions, procedures. Sometimes we have this, reference here that, look, you need to have institutions. I hope it's not David Bell who is calling. And not Napoleon's spirit. So, and he has, look, if you look at, for example, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic period, the American Revolution, you will find people. You will find George Washington. You will find even Robespierre. You will find Napoleon. You will find, I don't know, in our history, it will be Petlura, for example, or Hrushevsky, or you name it. So democracy is not only about procedures, rules, it's all very important, but at a certain moment of time, you need people, you need personalities. And I do think that in kind of a Western civilization, it was very underestimated. So people so much believed in this Kantian idea that we will build institutions in which even devils will be good. With all my respect to Emmanuel, who has 300th anniversary right now, he was wrong. If you don't have, because he forgot this ancient Greek idea that polis is about educating citizens, educating people. Polis is about education, and the charisma of people, the decisiveness of certain leaders is very important. Therefore, I think we do have a lack of certain leadership all around the world right now. We might have different attitudes to our president. I know that people outside love him much more than sometimes Ukrainians, but and there are some very big impediments with his kind of a messianistic, self-imposed messianistic role, leadership role. But it's true that we have a leader. We have a leader, positive or negative, but we have the story that a person can play a certain role in history has come back. And I think we need to go too far with this, because I have the impression that it's now going too far, that Zelensky, forgets that, well, it's not him who defend Ukraine only, it's the people, it's us, it's the army, it's volunteers, it's citizens. But I do think we came back to this idea of the person in history.
Brilliant response. I will add one tiny detail about just thinking about what Volodymyr told to your question. I would absolutely agree that this is about, so when you talk leadership, we talk leaders, so we talk people. There is no leadership like an abstraction, so we are talking about people. So this is about people being stronger than institutions. And when you talk leader in the context you mentioned, so this Grenzsituation, I'm not sure to pronounce it correctly, about the war, about what we face, it's about the absence of fear, not angst, but fear. So it's about fairness, and we met a lot of people who are not afraid, but they are not leaders. They are just brave people who are when we travel to the edge, and this is not so difficult not to have fear. I have a great potential, and maybe there are people not on the right places not to be leaders. So we are, I think we'll have a kind of generation of very strong people here in Ukraine, just because the situation, you have no right to be otherwise. So you have to be brave, you have to lose your fear, and to look openly at the reality. Because if you look openly at the reality and you are not afraid of some ghosts of you're not thinking about the past, you're fearless.
Yeah, I'll bring that question back to the issue of choice, the role of the individual in choice, because there are various moments historians obsess about classically, because one of the problems with history as a discipline is that in the best case we can explain what happened, when, with whom, where, and how. You can never decisively say why, because you can't do a control study on real life. There's no way to go back, run the scene again, hold certain variables constant in the interest of figuring out what was actually causal. So we're always in this space where there are historical structures playing a role. There's a situation in which somebody finds themselves. There's the role of individual choice, and there's the role of chance. There's that cocktail that can never completely be disentangled. And there are certain classic moments of that. There is, as we've all been thinking about now, there's Chamberlain's infamous decision at Munich, when he decides to give Hitler the Sudetenland. There is Benish's decision, Volodya and I were talking about this on the way here, not to fight, which was, those were historic decisions. There's the Germans' decision in 1917 to smuggle Lenin back from Switzerland in that sealed German train car. And I tell my students, arguably, anything happens to that sealed German train car, and Lenin does not get to Petrograd in April 1917, and I think arguably there's no Bolshevik revolution, and the whole 20th century as we know it does not happen that way. Can't be proven, and when I saw on February 25th, watching it from New Haven streamed, and when Zelensky went out onto the street with those 4 guys and said, "Ja, President tut," it's not that I thought he's the Messiah, he's going to save the world, they have a perfect person. I thought that was a historic moment of decision making. Because he made that choice, we now live in a different world. Now, what will happen henceforth, we don't know.
Thank you so much for your fantastic dialogue, and in this good company of Gusserl and Roman Ingarden, we can also mention Dmytro Czyżewski. I think his name was not mentioned, but that question of the death and Gogol and the borderline, it's really the central question for Dmytro Czyżewski. And for example, his critical dialogue with Frank, and some kind of German tradition, German nihilism. It's very important. So what do you think about it? And also his dialogue, critical dialogue with Shestov. You didn't mention also, maybe it's paradoxical to speak, what do you think about political thinker Shestov? You know his article about Bolshevism. And Bolshevism, it's about the end of dialogue, the end of truth, the end of dignity, etc. And it was his experience in Kyiv after Bolshevik Revolution. 20 years ago, I published Ukrainian translation of this article about Bolshevism in Ducha Litera Review. So it's interesting, and it's not the orientation beyond rationalism, etc. On the contrary. So we can also testify, we can analyze Shestov as political thinker. Thank you so much.
I've been obsessing about precisely that text. So Shestov wrote this text, Что такое русский Bolshevism, in 1920, I think shortly after he had escaped from Kiev via Crimea and gone to Switzerland. And after February 24th, 2022, I have gone back to that text. And in fact, I really wanted to teach that text to my students this semester. And as far as I know, there's never been English translation of it. And he says a couple things in that text, one of which is about the impossibility of describing what is happening, that which is beyond description. And I've been thinking about that. I have not been to Kherson. And I was texting, at the moment Kherson was liberated, a friend of mine, a young Polish journalist, Paweł Pieniążek, was in Kherson. I love Paweł. Paweł's an extraordinarily talented young Polish writer who has been covering really since 2014 this war. And he's a wonderful writer. And, when he was in Kherson, it was the first time he ever said to me, and if I'm translating from his Polish here, he's like, I have never experienced anything like the atmosphere in Kherson at the moment it was liberated. And when I saw him this summer, he said, I still haven't found the words to express what I saw and felt in Kherson when it was liberated. It was that which was, even for him who, as his profession, goes around and describes people in extreme situations, he's a war reporter, he said, I haven't yet found language that is kind of adequate for this. So there was Shestov saying what we are experiencing, what's going on, it's something that is beyond words. He also talks about the problem of subjectivity in Russia in a way I think is deeply relevant to what's going on. That sense that, you have to, what needed to be done is to instill in these people this idea that they were citizens, that they had responsibility, that they were agents, and that's what has not happened. They're still in this mode of being objects, as opposed to subjects. you know, and in that mode, you're never, like, nothing is ever could move forward, you know, and this sense of Bolshevism as this kind of nihilism. And this is someone who in various ways was very sympathetic to the left and sympathetic to socialism, but this idea of the nihilism, which I've been going back to. I mean, Konstantin asked this question. You described in an interview that what was going on now from the Russian side is nihilism made systemic, which I found a very kind of inspired quote and description. You know, and it relates to Volodya's idea of necrophilia. You know, this sense of just utterly, you also, I think you both described this war early on after the full-scale invasion as a zero-sum game. It's just death and destruction for nothing. Just, you know, you have these 20-year-old kids, you know, going in and slaughtering and torturing these 40-year-old women who could be their mothers, who are speaking their own, for what? For nothing. I mean, just destruction after destruction, you know, and that countering, this goes back to the Grenza, you know, can you then counter that nihilism, and what does nihilism really mean, with some kind of meaning that is stronger than it? And Natalia Gumanyuk's theme for the book Arsenal last year was when everything matters, you know, and how do you take this when everything matters? How do you gather up that meaning in such a way that's going to be stronger than that nihilism? And I see in Shestrov something that maybe kind of gives us a direction to pursue that. But if anyone has an answer for how to do that, please go.
I will just add about Chizhevsky that I think we have this pantheon of intellectuals who are kind of filling the gaps in culture by themselves, and I think it's a wonderful pantheon with which we really need to work. I mentioned Lesya Ukrainka is definitely one of them. Franco is definitely one of them. Chizhevsky, Shevelov, Lysak Rudnitsky, Pritsak. So when people understand that there are so many gaps in understanding, that they fill these gaps. And another idea of Chizhevsky, which I admire, is that, and which relates to our discussion, is that he understood that in history you can have diachrony. So when, and this is a very interesting idea, the way how he interprets Skovroda is saying, okay, he's probably the last Baroque philosopher, but he's the first Romantic philosopher. So he is Baroque in the 18th century when Baroque was gone in Europe, but he is Romantic in the 18th century when there is still no Romanticism. And I think it's a wonderful idea that you can have diachrony in history, and this gives you also freedom of creativity and freedom to overcome this idea of historic nations or non-historic. Is Gillian, yeah?
Hi, Gillian from Internews. Volodymyr, at the beginning of this conversation, he uses really beautiful English word, liminal. And it made me think, this has been very wide-ranging intellectual discussion, and I'm thinking, as a Scottish person, what can I contribute to this? So I thought that it reminded me that in the Scottish pagan tradition, which is, by the way, not entirely dissimilar to the Ukrainian pagan tradition, the idea of liminal times is an idea about a time when you are in the midst of change, when there's change happening all around you, and the change has not happened yet. Like the changes between normal changes normally, like changes between seasons. And at the same time, there is also a sense of the barriers between the living and the dead are removed during liminal times. And it feels to me like in these days we are living in a liminal period which is very, very long. It feels like we are enduring a liminal change which is taking a long time to arrive at. And I think that's true a little bit of the United States in a very different way than it is for Ukraine, where it's extremely existential, but also there are existential questions facing the United States with the election. I'm just thinking about, as an active citizen, to go back from being a leader to being a person, what is the role that you should play, what are the actions that you should take in order to be part of achieving the end result that you want to achieve during that liminal period. Do you have any advice from the philosophers and the historians for us on that question?
Only have difficult questions today. Well, I really like your idea about liminal time. So to look at that as a time from the temporary point of view, not the space. And we started our discussion about time, and we haven't finished it, unfortunately. You know, I was thinking a lot during our trips about time during the torture. For example, we talked to people who were tortured, and we are thinking about what Henri Bergson, French philosopher, was writing that time, it's not about quantity, this is about quality. So the time is not just seconds, minutes, hours, or days, nights, months, weeks. So we live time according to experience which is inside this time. So you can easily imagine minutes which last like hours, in case of torture, for example. And we can easily imagine days which lie like minutes when we are, I don't know, we are happy, we are satisfied, and so the time, so human being never lives a time like in a mechanic way. And that's why what you're talking about the liminal times which last too long, in fact. So it's quite too long, it lasts, it's never ending story. And we all want for sure to end. And I think we all understand that it will be no short ending for these liminal times. Volodymyr is talking about dark times. I'm not sure that it's dark times, but it's difficult times for everybody. I think that, first of all, it's not a simple answer because I don't have an answer to the question, but I think that we are to act as if we could change something. As if we could change something, even if we cannot change it on our personal level. So when we think about what we do personally, I'm always impressed by how small it is. Whatever you do as a person, it's too small. Whatever you do, even if you walk a lot, as we do with Volodymyr, you do whatever you can in multiple, roles. It still is so little you can do about it. But then I think about that if everybody does as much as we can to change the situation, maybe there will be a way to put an end to these liminal times and to change the situation for better.
А можна, будь ласка, питання? У мене мікрофон є.
Thank you. I'm Victoria. I'm Volodymyr's and Gillian's friend. Thank you for discussing Ukrainian cultural tradition. I love culture and music. And today is 94 years of our living legend, Lina Kostenko. And I would like a couple of words from both of you, Tanya and Volodya, about, I know you love to talk about the role of women in Ukraine's history, and she is the living history. Just a couple of words about her role. And Marci, if you don't know her, you must know her. You must get to know her. She was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1960s of the past century. And then after the Orange Revolution, she refused the title of the national hero and Orden of the national hero of Ukraine with the words, "I do not wear political jewelry." Thank you.
For the speaker, I'm a moderator.
I have a question maybe to Marci, to anybody, if I'm not sure about Lina's translated into English, if she's translated. Do you know her texts? No. is she translated or not? So that's a problem. Some texts are translated. So yeah, all I can say that that she's a great poet. She's a living author, and let's talk the most about our writers while they're still alive, because we have this habit to talk not a lot about people who are still alive, and then we talk a lot about them when they are dead. And yeah, I remember that she is from this very important generation, and I remember being in school. When being in school, we already studied her poetry, and she's a great poet here. And maybe one day it's a good idea to translate her into English, and not only English. Why not some other European languages as well?
I think that this is we have a podcast with Tanya about women in the Ukrainian culture. And I think this is really remarkable how at any moment of the Ukrainian culture, you have the leader, the woman who is one of the leaders. So we definitely have Markovchuk, who is one of the leaders of this, narodnictvo, and I think very underestimated. We have, of course, modernists, literature with Lessing, with Olga Kobylanska, and with others. And I think Lina, because I'm not a big knower of her work and expert, but I do think that this is a very interesting epoch, what we call Шестидесятники. There is a wonderful book just published by Radomir Mokrek about Шестидесятники, and he shows, I think, in a very interesting way how basically the moment when in the Soviet Union you kind of you went to this vidliha, ottepel, and so forth and so on and so forth, you have this outburst of culture, which was immediately repressed already by the late 60s and by early 70s. So you have all those people like Ukrainian dissidents, who also are not very well known, both the Shideshatniki and the dissidents of the 70s, who are not very well known in the West still, right? So there is a work of studying them, and I know that both Marci and Tim are very interested in this generation. Because this generation, for me personally, I think this is a generation that maybe, I mean, not for the first time, but it's a generation that try to combine two like value ideas, the idea of individuality and the idea of community. If you think about Lesya Ukrainka, like the early 20th century, you continuously see the conflict between individual and community. This is one of the topics of her work. What Шестидесятники, as I understand them, try to do is to combine, and then dissidents, to combine these two agendas, which is patriotic agenda and liberal agenda, which is a remarkable thing to do, actually. If we think about like 21st century, when the idea of all over the world, when the idea of patriotism and individualism just go into different directions. When you have in America, you have radicalization of liberalism and then radicalization of conservatism, and then you have these troubles. I think our tradition of Шестидесятники and Dissidente is the tradition that, I mean, from Шестидесятники to Helsinki movement, is the tradition when you do have this synthesis under the idea of individual and the idea of community, which is a normal thing, which should not be controversial, because it's normal that we are individuals who fight for our freedom, but we are also live in the community and depend on each other. Sorry for taking too long.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you about this lecture and a little bit excuse about my English, because it's very hard to speak an important term on foreign languages, and I want to speak about limit, not about borderline, because I think the limit is more wide word, and in context of limit, it's very important to pair with some wholenesses, holistic, because without this, the limit haven't anything. And during your speech, you have one example like after the death, we have a nothing. It's a philosopher answer, but if we answer for uncertainty, this change all, change anything. Only one answer can change anything. Another life, it change anything. Or judgment date, it change anything. So I want to talk about limit, that our mind have a limit. Then our face have a limit. Our willing have a limit. Our feeling have a limit. And if we talk about a limit, we have two positions. First, from one limit, from one space, we come to another space when we extend the limit, broke the limit, or we have another position when from one space we came to uncertainty. And from uncertainty, the limit doesn't exist. And from uncertainty, we can create a new world. From uncertainty, we can create a new name and create a new limit. And this is a position of creator. I think for humanity, from our country, from US, from whole people, it's a very important thing. Try work from a, not work, try to have a possible to look from a position of house, uncertainty, and not from position and how to keep the one certainty, how to extend our certainty, our limits. Really important question, how to keep our limits, but I think it's also important.
See? Now we are lost in translation.
In condition.
But Marci will respond in the way how she understands the question.
Oh, in conditions of uncertainty. So the relationship is it the relationship between limits and uncertainty? Yeah, I mean the condition of life is that we live in uncertainty, and so much of human thought and human endeavor is an attempt to find certainty, is an attempt to find that grounding. You know, certainty so in German it's Sicherheit, and in Husserl's diary, you know, he was writing, Ich kann ohne Sicherheit nicht leben. You know, I cannot live without certainty. I need to know. Like this, the uncertainty is unbearable. And Shestov's answer was that the point of philosophy is to teach us to live with uncertainty, because there is no such thing in this world, you know, as certainty. You know, it's all some kind of an illusion. Hannah Arendt talks about Bodenlosigkeit, this kind of this Bezpochvenos, this kind of this groundlessness, which is endemic. I mean, it's inherent in the human condition, you know, because, you know, and all sorts of attempts have been made, you know, to create structures that give us certainty. You know, in some ways, Marxism was the last great attempt, right? Like, history is going to move inexorably, inevitably, in a given direction, you know, and we can count on something. But in some ways, the tragedy of the human condition, you know, is the fact that that's not true. I'll answer with an anecdote. So my son, who's now 13, and is constantly asking these questions about, like, why doesn't life have a meaning? And I'm like, it's up to us, going back to the question of liminality, because the meaning of life is that we have to give it a meaning. You know, it goes back to liminal, such as like it's incumbent upon us, you know, to create the meaning, to provide the meaning. What was I going to say? This idea about yes, Caleb uncertainty. You know, and when he was maybe 7 years old, he said to me he was a kid who had a lot of trouble sleeping. Some of you here, my former students, know him. And he said to me one night, he said, you know, Mommy, I can't sleep. I feel like home is not a very safe place. And I said, well, why do you feel that way? He said, well, I was thinking that a meteor could come and hit our house, you know, or a storm could come and blow the roof off, you know, or a robber could break in through the window and try to kill us. And I had to restrain myself from, like, the answer I was tempted to give him, which was the real answer, was, I know exactly how you feel. I'm afraid of all those things too. But the problem is not being at home carries the same risk, because the tragedy of the human condition is that there is no such thing as a secure place in the world, because we live in conditions of uncertainty. But there are times like what you are all experiencing where that is illuminated in extremity. So now you are the ones to teach all of us what it means to live in conditions of extreme uncertainty.
I guess you got a new great existentialist philosopher in the house.
A very Ukrainian one, by the way. This very Ukrainian feeling to never be sure if matter is coming to you directly to your house. So this very Ukrainian philosopher you have at home.
More questions?
We have here.
Ah, okay, sorry. Somebody decides.
So thank you for a wonderful lecture, truly. Since this discussion has been largely about intellectuals, my question will be also connected to it. So I think it is a nice intellectual exercise to try to turn to the intellectuals from previous centuries who experienced some kinds of wars or mass violences. This is what I did. I turned to Susan Sontag and I tried to think what she would say about the current war, but this is nothing more than an intellectual exercise in a sense, because she doesn't live this war, and as much as we can also, I think, build on Bergson's idea of being in time, I think he described that the current moment is always on the verge of becoming, but in my mind it was, well, the Ukrainian moment is always on the verge of ending, and this is what the lecture was also about. I'm just thinking about the quote from Erich Maria Remarque, who said that when there is history somewhere, you have to come and be present and witness the history yourself, so you have to be the witness. But as much as all those quotes resonate with me and they prompt their reflections, I'm also thinking that we cannot just borrow their dictionary of war and we cannot use their words to describe the present, because this war, I think, is unconditional. And I don't remember whose quote it was, but somebody said that it is indescribable from the lecture. And this is what I'm thinking, because with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, in some sense, nothing changed, but everything became very different, because the mass graves in cities, they were already existent. And the holes from artillery shells in the fields, they also existed, but in the east of Ukraine. They just became bigger in scale. So the question is necessarily, how do we describe it? How do we talk about it? How do we remember these different experiences? Thank you.
Okay, Natalia's one of my students. That's a very big question. If I had the answers for all of these, how to describe. I mean, to some extent, that is what intellectual life continues to be about. Our attempt to provide language at a moment when life is constantly exceeding the boundaries of language. I mean, one of the questions I'd like to ask Tanya and Volodya is what's happened to language during the war? Because there's always this kind of inflation. I mean, you run out of words. Words become stale. Words have to be reconceptualized. How do you find those new words? Do you find them in interaction with other languages and other traditions, with going back? I mean, part of the tradition that I still, in a very perhaps naive, idealistic way, continue to believe in about the role of intellectuals is close to Remarque. Like, it's incumbent on us, to look the truth in the eye and try to speak about it. It's incumbent upon us to speak the truth. Now we live in these post-truth times, and so who believes in truth anymore? But I still feel like, Arendt says about Eichmann in Jerusalem, when she was so viciously attacked and she got death threats, and she said, well, I had a choice. The choice was I could write and say what I thought, or I could be silent. But I didn't have a choice to write, and pull back. I mean, there's a very short essay that Vika Amelina wrote, that she wrote in English, that I've been going back to a lot since her horrible death, and it's called "Nothing Bad Ever Happened Here," and she says that as not because she believes it, but she's talking about her home. She's talking about Lviv, and she says that the idea that one can live in this place, and be a writer of this place and a thinker of this place, and pretend that the Second World War didn't happen, that the Holocaust didn't happen, that Stalinism didn't happen, that we're not living on these graves, that is not, we can't be real in that way. She's like, the thing about these ghosts is that you only really have a home in the world when you invite the ghost to breakfast. And I keep going back to this, like her metaphor of inviting the ghost to breakfast. And in some sense, I think like that in both the ghost, and the horrors of the present, and Tanya and Volodya are going and talking to people who are victims of torture, have been victims of torture. To me, this has been something that I find the most absolutely chilling, and I'm unable, I'm in some ways unable to take it in, unable to deal with it. But like I did a book panel with Stanislav Asayev last year, and for that reason, it was the first time I forced myself to read every word of that book that he wrote about. I had read excerpts from it before, but I couldn't bring myself to get through the whole thing. I forced myself to read the whole thing, and to sit there with him, and to think, we have to look this in the eye. Even when it's impossible, even when we don't have language, that if we have any purpose here, that's what we try to do as imperfectly as we do it.
And coming to this metaphor of bringing ghosts to breakfast, I recall the synchronization in Birkenwald by Frankl when he invites Socrates, Kant, and Spinoza to try to make sense. What if you had this power of seance? What ghost of thinkers, leaders, actors would each of you would bring to this breakfast to make sense of our existential situation, maybe in solution-oriented fashion, or just to deepen understanding?
I would call only Hamlet's father.
But you have two more to pick.
This is a good question. I would definitely bring Shestov and Arendt. I've been like, I'm always obsessively going back to Arendt. The third is an interesting question. Who would I bring? Thinking about, I've gone back to Kant a lot, but I think maybe I already know what he would say.
He usually doesn't show up on breakfast. He waits until dinner.
I'd invite Lesia Ukrainka just to make Volodymyr jealous. He will do decades without you.
Without me? All the best meetings you have are without me. So I think I would invite Blaise Pascal. I think I'm reading him a lot. And among Ukrainian authors, I would be rushing through all the places seeking for Tanya and Lesia, but I think I really need to talk to people like Ivan Bahrani. He interests me a lot, and I would really need to talk to I think Stefanik. But basically, what interests me is those people who are living in these dark times, who have this element of volcano in their history. And basically, if we look at the history of philosophy, it's not that rare that we have such people. So it's naive to think that philosophy is just done, or literature is just done in calm times. People were living through very, very harsh times. I mean, people like Cervantes or Shakespeare, or I don't know, or Walter Benjamin, about whom I wrote my first book, and even Husserl. I mean, he lived through very, very difficult times. First World War and the front line, and people like Sigmund Freud, and these are the classics whom we know are actually experienced the war as in that horrible way as we are experiencing it.
Freud is a good idea. As I was just talking to Jirko Prohasko about Freud.
I'm afraid that he will find out my Oedipus complex on the second minute of the conversation.
Leszek Kolakowski, the Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski.
I would prefer Czesław Miłosz if we talk about the Polish.
If we can invite many, get mentioned, so
Please
too
do.
many. Kundera, for example, why not?
Who from the French tradition would you?
Arthur Rimbaud. What you were talking about, undescriptible, responding to the question about undescriptible things. So this is poetry, but it's also about describing undescriptible things. So Rimbaud, yes, it would be with great pleasure. Why not? And Baudelaire, maybe for, not for breakfast, but for the dinner. So let's.
Not sure you can talk about Baudelaire, but with people like Paul Valéry, probably. So you need people who are able to talk, not only to. More questions? Master of the microphone.
Thank you very, very much. It struck the chord with me when you were talking about death, looking at death, memento mori, and when you were talking about birth. As for me, it doesn't contradict, because when you think of death, you try to do whatever you can, not to miss a thing, to give birth to something. And for me, birth is always about love. You give birth to a baby, it's a pure love. You give birth to some project with people you love, to people you love. And I would like to ask you to think about what we can give birth to. I mean, all of us globally, all the participants of this war, which is, I think, global, despite it's being fought on the territory of Ukraine. All of us can give birth to in this borderline situation we are into. I mean, globally. Yeah, thank you.
I'll be short, we can give birth to victory, to start with.
Well, maybe if I can say something about your victory again, like it's not my war and won't be my victory, but I've appropriated this expression, pisla peremohi, which I find very inspiring. And I'm going to mention something here that my friend Krzysztof Czyżewski, a Polish thinker, talked about when we talked about the problem of language and what was happening in this war. And so Krzysztof is a native Polish speaker, and he has very good passive Ukrainian. And he said that he loves the word перемога because it's quite different from победа, and it's quite different from zwycięstwo, which is the Polish version, and it's different from victory because it etymologically actually gives this peri, this kind of beyond, this kind of crossing, and moha of possibilities. So it literally brings us this language of beyond what is possible, beyond what we can do, beyond hitherto existing possibilities. And Krzysztof was saying at a discussion we had this summer, he's like, that's the word that the rest of us need to import from the Ukrainian experiments, this idea of перемога, that it's not just about restoring what had been or catching up with something else somewhere else. It has to be a victory that is beyond the possibilities that any of us have seen before, that will point us to the future and give us hope for something more. And I cling to that. I realize that puts a great burden on all of you, but
I told Krzysztof, that his idea is, I quoted him many times, and his idea is really living in Ukraine. But it's remarkable then American professor comes to Kyiv to quote Polish philosopher, thinking about the Ukrainian language, talking about Jewish Kyiv philosopher, and then Germans and French and Ukrainians. Thank you very much, Marci Shore. And thank you, Tanya Harkova, and thank you, Kyiv School of Economics, PEN Ukraine, Ukraine World. Thank you very much.